Hello, my name is Jordan Robinson, and for my research, I chose to speak about Charles Spurgeon, who was known as the Prince of Preachers. He was British, and most of his ministry took place in his native England, but there is no doubt that his impact reached far beyond England, and his impact was and continues to be particularly strong across the pond in the United States. The issue that brought great controversy around Charles Spurgeon were his views on slavery. Slavery had already been abolished in England, and it was abolished in 1833. But Spurgeon thought it was necessary to challenge this issue altogether. Most people recognize that slavery was accepted amongst much of Southern society in the United States, while many in the North condemned the institution. This was the backdrop that Spurgeon found himself in, and he was seen by many as a hero and many as a villain because of his views on slavery. Glenn Giansona, who is a professor of history at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee and who got his PhD from Florida State University, he showed the position that many Baptists in the South took. Spurgeon was himself a Baptist, so the writers at the Memphis Baptist Messenger were attacking one of their own when they printed this, quote, "But then, if those who lived farthest off from the slavery are the best judges of its real character, we suppose that Mr. Spurgeon ought to know more about it than any resident in the South. But even he must know less about it than the denizens of Ireland and Lapland, for he is no farther north than the halfway house to a thorough knowledge of slavery, which can be attained only by a residence near the polar sea." This was a sarcastic barb, and it was pretty tame considering some of the cruel and violent language that was directed at Mr. Spurgeon when he spoke out against slavery. I looked at a dissertation by Larry James Michael, who studied at Southern Baptist Theological Seminary, and this thesis identified several controversies that Charles Spurgeon dealt with during his ministry. It shows how he became incensed at the slaveholders when a freed slave spoke at a church gathering in England. It was later brought to Spurgeon's attention that his sermons were edited for his audience in the United States. Any negative words towards the institution of slavery were expelled from the sermons. The response of Spurgeon was to decry slavery as a soul-destroying sin and an iniquity that cries aloud for vengeance. Spurgeon received death threats, and his books were publicly burned. There's mention made of one man named John Andrew Jackson, who was a fugitive slave from South Carolina. Jackson was highly influential on Spurgeon. They were able to meet, and Spurgeon responded with a very passionate appeal for the end of slavery. And this contained a vivid description of the pains of warfare slaveholding American regions may have to experience. So he's saying it might be necessary to go to war to end slavery. Larry Michael drew extensively from the work of Godfrey Pike's The Life and Work of Charles Haddon Spurgeon. Pike's biography contained this quote from Spurgeon. Spurgeon said, "I believe slavery to be a crime of crimes, a soul-destroying sin, and an iniquity which cries aloud for vengeance." So Spurgeon clearly believed that slavery was destructive to slaves and slave owners. I'd like to share with you a quote from one of Mr. Spurgeon's sermons, and I think this really shows the worldwide perspective Spurgeon had. He said, "It will be a gathering from very great distances. Some of the wheat ripens in the South Sea, islands in China and in Japan. Some flourishes in France. Broad acres grow in the United States. There is scarce a land without a portion of the good grain. Where all God's wheat grows, I cannot tell. There is a remnant according to the election of grace among every nation and people, but the angels will gather all the good grain to the same garner. So Spurgeon believed that this gospel was for all peoples, and he specifically mentions the United States in this statement. During this time of controversy, the St. Cloud Democrat, which is published in St. Cloud, Minnesota, had a very short blurb about the subtraction of Spurgeon's statements on slavery in his sermons that were printed in America. The situation was brought to the fore actually by Henry Ward Beecher, who's a well-known pastor and abolitionist. So the blurb references the Independent newspaper to confirm the allegation. It highlights the fact that Spurgeon was a well-liked teacher, except for his stance on the institution of slavery. This shows that there were those who supported his presentation of the gospel, but did not want to inhibit the sale of Spurgeon resources by containing his words on slavery. The censoring of Spurgeon caused a reaction booksellers were likely not keen on, though. When Spurgeon was confronted with the issue, he addressed it publicly. Because of this information, he condemned slavery in America specifically, which drew the ire of the pro-slavery Southerners. In the Ashtabula Weekly Telegraph, Ashtabula is a city in Ohio, which outlawed slavery in its constitution. This account of slavery was likely agreed upon by the readers in Ashtabula, and it was delivered to Sheldon and Company publishers Watchman and Reflector, and this was recorded in the Ashtabula Weekly Times. So there's a quotation from Spurgeon, and it's the announcement that he will convene with men of all creeds except with a slaveholder. This was too serious a social ill for Spurgeon to disregard. Spurgeon stated that he would receive a murderer into his church or into friendship as soon as he would a man stealer, which is his term for a slave owner. Spurgeon addressed the accusation that he edited out any references to slavery for publication by denying any such part. He admitted that there were sins a many in England as well, but he would not spare the United States from pointing out their sin in the maintenance of slavery. Spurgeon further remarked that he would be sure to speak against slavery from the pulpit, since his words would meet the ears of the Americans. Spurgeon even praised John Brown for his stance at Harper's Ferry. In the National Era newspaper from October 1857, the National Era was a weekly abolitionist newspaper that was published in Washington, D.C. This newspaper had an interesting dialogue between Charles Spurgeon and an American minister identified only as Jonathan. Spurgeon asked, when he found out Jonathan was an American minister, Spurgeon asked Jonathan if he segregated the black and white people from one another in the church services. When he indicated that yes, there was segregation in the church, he then asked him if he separated the people during the Lord's Supper, to which Jonathan said yes. He indicated that African American people were partitioned by a curtain from Caucasian Americans. Spurgeon then proceeded to ask Jonathan if he knew what a monomaniac was, and that he was a monomaniac regarding slavery. He showed him his knife and said if he stayed longer, he may put his knife into the man's chest because of his monomania. So this is an interesting account between the two men. Spurgeon was not willing to ignore the problem of slavery in the South, and this provides a window into the relationship of Southern Baptists and Charles Spurgeon, who was also a Baptist, but very much against this issue that separated the Baptist Church in America. The outflow of Spurgeon's comments on slavery in the American South led to book burnings. And this was in the New York Times in a piece called Mr. Spurgeon's Sermons. Reverend Captain Humphrey H. Cooper was responsible for leading the book burning in Virginia. It took place at the Matthews County Courthouse on Gwynn Island. There was a crowd assembled for the burning with people who traveled from Gloucester and Middlesex. Cooper was described as a very wealthy gentleman who lived on the island. Cooper had previously been an admirer of Spurgeon, but this quickly changed when he read the words of Charles regarding John Brown and the necessity of ending slavery in the United States, to the point that it would be better if all the white people were killed than slavery continue in peace. One of Spurgeon's quotations from the pulpit were included in this article, where he stated, quote, "Better every white man, woman, and child be murdered in the South, and 1,000 unions be dissolved, than human slavery be allowed to exist in peace and quietness in the southern states of the American Union." The source went so far as to question whether Spurgeon was even a true Christian, based upon these comments. The actions of Mr. Cooper were praised, and other denominations were encouraged to follow suit. Another Virginia newspaper, the Daily Dispatch, really tore down Spurgeon for the public. He was referred to as, quote, "the great overrated." An unnamed American pastor supposedly brought this account upon his visit to England, where he was able to hear Spurgeon preach. He said that Spurgeon appeared as a fat, overgrown boy, unctuous, unwholesome. Midwestern Seminary published a piece on the controversy in the university's magazine, and this was useful in finding primary sources regarding the controversy. The article referenced a quote found in Godfrey Holden Pike's The Life and Work of Charles Haddon Spurgeon. He said, "I do from my inmost soul detest slavery, and although I commune at the Lord's table with men of all creeds, yet with a slaveholder I have no fellowship of any sort or kind. Whenever one is called upon me, I have considered it my duty to express my detestation of his wickedness, and I would as soon think of receiving a murderer into my church as a man-stealer." A Florida newspaper was the Southern Opinion. The piece was called "A Southern Opinion of the Reverend Mr. Spurgeon," and it was in the New York Herald. And it said that Spurgeon was a, quote, "beef-eating, puffed-up, vain, over-righteous, pharisaical English blab-mouth." A Louisiana newspaper, the Bossier Banner, called Spurgeon a hell-deserving Englishman. In South Carolina, the Charleston Courier called Spurgeon a vulgar young man with soiled, sleek hair, prominent teeth, and a self-satisfied air. In North Carolina, the piece called Reverend Mr. Spurgeon from the weekly Raleigh Register said, "Many would like a good opportunity at this hypocritical preacher. And anyone selling Spurgeon's sermons in Raleigh should be arrested and charged with circulating incendiary publications." And in that same article from the seminary, the question was posed, what would have happened if Spurgeon had visited the southern states in 1860 as he planned to do? And the answer was that America may have executed Mr. Spurgeon. Quoting from the Southern Reporter and Daily Commercial Courier, in an article called "Mr. Spurgeon's Sermons Burned by American Slave Owners," it said, "If the Pharisaical author should ever show himself in these parts, we trust that a stout cord may speedily find its way around his eloquent throat." And Mr. Spurgeon faced some troubles because of his stance against slavery. George Carter Needham, who was an American who immigrated from Ireland to Pennsylvania, quoted Spurgeon in this 1883 biography, The Life and Labors of Charles H. Spurgeon. Spurgeon said, "The large sale of my sermons in America, together with my wife's economy, enabled me to spend from $3,000 to $4,000 in a year in my own favorite work. But on a sudden, owing to my denunciation of the then existing slavery in the States, my entire resources from that book Cherith were dried up. I paid as large sums as I could from my own income and resolved to spend all I had and then take the cessation of my means as a voice from the Lord to stay the effort, as I am firmly persuaded that we ought under no pretense to go into debt." So he was facing personal struggle because of the loss of funds from his sale of books in the United States. The topic of emancipated slaves in Spurgeon's homeland was discussed and included that they were part of the church in the UK. He discussed the passing of President Andrew Garfield and the twin grief of Americans and the English people. It also revealed Spurgeon's relationship with the U.S. It recorded arrival of hundreds of Americans in the summer months to gather at the Metropolitan Tabernacle to hear Spurgeon preach. And the book also provided an assessment of the situation with finding pastors for American churches. It spoke about how there were American congregations that were willing to pay Charles Spurgeon to come to America and teach. So this helps draw a connection between the United States and Mr. Spurgeon. A published historian, David Nelson Duke, penned an article called Charles Haddon Spurgeon's Social Concern Exceeding an Individualistic Self-Help Ideology, and this was in the Baptist History and Heritage. So Spurgeon preached a sermon entitled Christian Sympathy, and this highlighted the stance Spurgeon took on slavery. Slavery was abolished 2 decades before Spurgeon gave this sermon, and so this would be directly pointed at places where slavery was still in existence, like the United States. When Spurgeon was confronted with the fact that some would try to use Scripture to justify holding slaves, Spurgeon remarked that he knew men who found texts to justify being damned. And so he did not wonder that men could find texts to justify, quote, buying and selling the souls of men. Spurgeon took some stances that would not be popular today. For instance, he agreed with a capital punishment of Indian people who mutinied against the British in 1857. So for Spurgeon to take this stance, he must have agreed with British colonialism on some level. But it is important to remember that from the perspective of Spurgeon and his generation, the verdict on colonialism was still out. Many British had not decided that it was a social wrong to colonize countries. And so we can't necessarily say that this was a complete contradiction of his ideas. So even though there was all this ire directed at Spurgeon, this was not enough to permanently mar his image in the eyes of the American people. A man named George Carter Needham, who I mentioned before, wrote in his 1883 biography, and this was in the beginning of the biography, quote, "No apology is needed for bringing before our American public in the present form the life and labors of this well-known, beloved, and faithful minister of Jesus Christ. Mr. Spurgeon has universal fame without seeking it. Free from selfishness and ambition, and without aiming at popularity, he has enshrined himself in the hearts of thousands and commanded the homage and respect of millions." So this was printed in the United States. It was available to American people. And this what shows that his image was not destroyed completely. In an article printed in the Cornwallis Gazette, there was an account of one American couple's visit to England. This family was called the Horner family, and Professor Horner explained that they went to the Metropolitan Tabernacle where Spurgeon had preached because Spurgeon, quote, has many friends in Oregon. This article is helpful because it demonstrates the enduring legacy of British pastor Charles Spurgeon in the U.S. even 14 years after his death. So they went to England in 1906, and the professor and his wife were looking through Spurgeon's photo album that their pastor, and they realized that their pastor had been trained by Spurgeon himself, and that their pastor, who now pastored in the U.S., had spoken to the overflow congregations that would meet in England. So then there were so many people going to hear Spurgeon speak that there would be overflow rooms for people to hear someone else speak. Spurgeon was clearly not deaf to the burdens of the American people, because he trained this pastor, Mark Noble, and the tour guide described him as being the closest of all to Spurgeon among the young men he trained for pastoral service. He even explained that there was, quote, "there was nothing that Mr. Spurgeon would not confide in him." So this demonstrates the close relationship between the two, and in a small way reflects the relationship between Spurgeon and the United States. So his image may have been temporarily tainted in the eyes of Southern slaveholders, but his overall legacy in the eyes of American Christians is a highly positive one. And in the Watchman and Southron, there was a periodical published in Sumter, South Carolina, which the location is really important because this is a Southern newspaper. And this was printed at the time of Spurgeon's death, so this was an obituary for Spurgeon. So on the surface level, it appears like any other obituary for a well-known personality. But Spurgeon was previously looked upon with disdain and sometimes violent intent by Southern slaveholders. So this demonstrates that there was a shift from public book burnings of Spurgeon's work to an account of his life that really highlights and promotes what he did. So many of the sources available are from Northern newspapers, so it is beneficial to see the Southern point of view as well. So the Southern point of view had changed. This article further explained his interest in theology, his conversion experience, and mentioned how he was picked apart by the media, as is often the case with people in the public eye. But it's interesting to note that in this article, the controversy surrounding slavery was not even mentioned. So the very issue that drove many Americans away from Spurgeon for some time is absent in the article. And it's further telling that Spurgeon is highly regarded in modern Southern Baptist churches. As slavery was an issue that divided the Baptist church in America, and personally, I know of two pastors in my own church who have named their sons Haddon after this well-known pastor. Thank you.